The letter fluttered from the postmaster's outstretched hand, tumbling end over end until it settled in the dust of Wallace Creek, Montana territory. It was 1877, and on that scorching July afternoon, Callie Chapman's future lay trampled beneath the hooves of a passing stagecoach, the carefully penned words of her intent to arrive as a mail-order bride now smudged with dirt and horse manure. Garrett Irwin had no idea his advertisement for a wife had yielded a response. 3 months had passed since he'd placed it in the Eastern newspaper on a foolish, whiskey-fueled night after watching his best friend marry. The 30-year-old cattle rancher had nearly forgotten about it altogether, focusing instead on the drought threatening his herd and the bank note coming due at summer's end. 500 miles east, Callie stood at the train platform in St. Louis, her entire life packed into one weathered trunk. At 24, she was considered firmly on the shelf by society's standards. After losing her position as a schoolteacher due to budget cuts, and with no family remaining after the influenza took her parents, Garrett Irwin's advertisement had seemed like divine intervention. "Last call for westbound train to Cheyenne," the conductor shouted. Callie gripped her ticket tighter. From Cheyenne, she would take the stagecoach north to Wallace Creek, Montana territory, to a man who had no idea she was coming. A man whose advertisement had captured her attention with its straightforward honesty. Rancher seeks educated, practical woman as wife. Good land, decent house, no fancy promises but fair treatment. G. Irwin, Wallace Creek, Montana territory. The journey west was grueling. The train cars were overcrowded and stifling in the summer heat. Callie clutched her small bag of possessions close, her larger trunk stowed in the baggage car. Inside her reticule was the reply from the Wallace Creek postmaster, not from Mr. Irwin himself, confirming receipt of her letter and providing directions to the Irwin ranch. What Callie didn't know was that the postmaster, Elijah Wilson, had indeed received her letter indicating acceptance of Mr. Irwin's proposal and her planned arrival date. But in the chaos of a town celebration, the letter meant for Garrett Irwin had been misplaced, then lost, then swept outside to meet its fate beneath stagecoach wheels. After days of uncomfortable travel, Callie arrived in Wallace Creek looking decidedly less pristine than when she'd departed St. Louis. Her blue traveling dress was wrinkled, her chestnut hair escaping its pins, and exhaustion lined her face. But determination still burned in her eyes as she stood in the dusty Main Street, looking around at the rustic frontier town. Wallace Creek wasn't much to look at: a main street with weathered wooden buildings, a saloon doing brisk business despite the early hour, a general store, and scattered homes. The mountains rose majestically in the distance, a startling contrast to the flat Missouri landscape she'd left behind. "Miss, you look a mite lost." A gangly young man approached, hat in hand. "Can I help you find something?" "I'm looking for the Irwin Ranch," Callie said. "I believe it's outside of town." The young man's eyebrows rose. "Garrett Irwin's place, that's about 5 miles northwest." "Not much out that way excepting his spread and a couple others." "Is there someone who might drive me there? I can pay." The boy scratched his head. "Well, Pete at the livery might rent you a horse, but—" His eyes drifted to her trunk. "That's a mighty big trunk for horseback." "Stagecoach don't go that direction." Callie's heart sank. She hadn't anticipated this logistical problem. "Headed to Irwin's, you say?" A deep voice interrupted. Callie turned to see a tall man loading supplies into a wagon. He wore dusty work clothes and a weathered hat pulled low, shading his face. "Yes, sir," she replied. "I'm expected, at least I believe I am." The man paused his work, studying her with shrewd eyes. Garrett expecting company, that'd be a first. Callie swallowed hard. "I'm Miss Chapman." "Callie Chapman. Mr. Irwin and I have corresponded about an arrangement." Understanding dawned in the stranger's eyes, followed quickly by confusion. "You don't say." "Well, miss, I'm headed out that direction. Could give you a ride if you don't mind sharing space with feed sacks and barbed wire." Relief flooded Callie. That would be most appreciated, Mr. Crawford. Thomas Crawford got the ranch neighboring Irwin's. He gestured to her trunk. That everything you brought. Yes, my worldly possessions. Crawford's expression was unreadable as he helped load her trunk. As they set off, Callie tried to calm her racing thoughts. Something wasn't right. The man's reaction suggested Garrett Irwin wasn't expecting her at all. The wagon jolted along the rutted dirt road, each bump sending a fresh wave of anxiety through Callie. The Montana landscape spread around them, rolling grasslands interrupted by stands of pine and aspen, nothing like the crowded streets of St. Louis she'd known all her life. "Mr. Crawford," she finally ventured, "you seemed surprised that Mr. Irwin was expecting a visitor." Crawford kept his eyes on the trail. "Garrett keeps to himself since his brother died, 2 years back now. Haven't seen him in town except for supplies or banking." "I see." Callie's fingers worried the fabric of her skirt. "We've been corresponding regarding his advertisement for a wife." At this, Crawford actually turned to look at her, surprise evident on his weathered face. A wife? Garrett advertised for a wife. The cold fear in Callie's stomach solidified into a block of ice. "Yes, in the Eastern papers, 3 months ago." Crawford shook his head slowly. "Miss Chapman, I don't mean to alarm you, but I've known Garrett Irwin for 15 years, and this is the first I've heard of any bride coming." "But I received confirmation from the postmaster that my letter was received," Callie protested, reaching into her reticule to produce the note. Crawford read it quickly, then handed it back. "That's Elijah Wilson's hand, all right, but something's not matching up here." Callie fought back tears. 500 miles from home, everything she owned in a trunk, and heading toward a man who had no idea she was coming. What had she done? "Mr. Crawford, perhaps I should return to town." "Let's not jump ahead," Crawford said kindly. "Garrett's a good man, rough around the edges but decent to his core. Let's see what he has to say." The remaining miles passed in tense silence. Finally, they crested a hill and Crawford pointed. "That's Irwin's place." The ranch spread before them, a sturdy 2-story house, a large barn, corrals, and beyond them, grassland where cattle grazed. It was larger and more established than Callie had imagined from the modest advertisement. As they approached, a tall figure emerged from the barn. Even from a distance, Callie could see he was solidly built, moving with the confident stride of a man accustomed to hard work. "That's Garrett," Crawford said unnecessarily. He pulled the wagon to a stop in the yard. Garrett Irwin approached, pushing his hat back to reveal dark hair and a face tanned by years in the sun. His expression was one of confusion as he took in the sight of his neighbor's wagon containing a city woman in a travel-worn dress. "Tom," he nodded to Crawford, then his gaze shifted to Callie. "Madam," Garrett, Crawford said, "this here is Miss Callie Chapman, says she's come about your advertisement." Garrett's brow furrowed deeper. "Advertisement?" Callie's heart plummeted. "The matrimonial advertisement you placed in the St. Louis Herald 3 months ago." Recognition flickered in Garrett's eyes, followed immediately by dismay. "Good Lord," he muttered, then louder. "Miss Chapman, I think there's been a misunderstanding." Callie felt the blood drain from her face. "You didn't place the advertisement?" "No, I did," Garrett admitted, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair. "But I never received any response. Figured no woman in her right mind would want to move to the middle of nowhere to marry a stranger." "I wrote you 6 weeks ago," Callie said, her voice trembling despite her efforts to remain composed. "The postmaster confirmed receipt of my letter." Garrett glanced at Crawford, who shrugged. "Elijah sent her confirmation, but Garrett never got her letter." Understanding dawned in Garrett's expression. "Wilson's been having trouble with his eyesight, probably misplaced it." The three stood in awkward silence. Callie fought back tears. All her hopes, her journey, her future based on a letter never received. "Miss Chapman," Garrett finally said, his voice gentler than before, "I'm sorry for the confusion. You've come an awful long way based on a misunderstanding." "I should return to town," Callie whispered, mortification washing over her. Garrett studied her tired face, the trunk loaded in Crawford's wagon. Evening was approaching and the temperature was already dropping with the setting sun. "Nonsense," he said firmly. "You'll stay here tonight at least. We've got a spare room. Tomorrow we can figure things out." "I couldn't impose. It's not imposing if I'm offering," Garrett interrupted. "Besides, it'll be dark before you'd reach town." Crawford nodded approvingly. "Miss Chapman, you'd best accept. Garrett's right about the timing." With few options available, Callie reluctantly agreed. Crawford helped unload her trunk while Garrett led the way into the house. The interior was surprisingly well-maintained for a bachelor's residence, simple but clean, with solid furniture. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room. "My housekeeper comes 3 times a week," Garrett explained, noting her surprise. "Kitchen's through there. Spare rooms upstairs, first door on the left, bathrooms at the end of the hall." Crawford tipped his hat. "I'll be heading out then. Garrett, you need anything, you send word." After Crawford departed, an uncomfortable silence fell between them. Callie stood awkwardly in the main room, unsure what to do next. "You must be hungry after your journey," Garrett finally said. "I was about to make dinner, nothing fancy, but there's plenty." "I'd be happy to cook," Callie offered quickly. "It's the least I can do for your hospitality." Garrett hesitated, then nodded. "Pantry's stocked. Help yourself." While Callie familiarized herself with the kitchen, Garrett disappeared outside, presumably to finish his evening chores. She found the kitchen surprisingly well organized, with a good cast iron stove and ample supplies. Within an hour, she had prepared a simple but hearty meal of beef stew, biscuits, and stewed apples. Garrett returned as she was setting the table. He'd washed up, his dark hair still damp, and changed his shirt. The transformation was subtle but noticeable. The rugged rancher cleaned up well. "Smells good," he said, appearing genuinely impressed as he took in the spread. They ate in awkward silence at first, each stealing glances at the other when they thought themselves unobserved. Callie noted his strong hands, the way his shoulders filled out his shirt, the intelligence in his green eyes. Garrett found himself studying her delicate features, the determined set of her chin, the way she maintained perfect posture despite her obvious exhaustion. "So," Garrett finally broke the silence, "you're a teacher?" Callie looked up, surprised. "Yes, how did you know?" "My advertisement specifically mentioned wanting an educated woman. Figured you must be a teacher or something similar." "I was, yes, in St. Louis, but the school board reduced staff and as the newest hire." She shrugged. "Their loss," Garrett commented, helping himself to another biscuit. "These are the best I've had since my mother was alive." The compliment warmed her. "Thank you. Your mother taught you to cook?" "Some. She died when I was 16. My brother Jack and I managed afterward until he married. Then after he and Sarah died in that influenza outbreak 2 years back, I've been on my own again." "I'm sorry about your brother," Callie said softly. "The same epidemic took my parents." Their eyes met across the table, a moment of shared understanding passing between them. "That advertisement," Garrett said after a moment, "I wrote it after too much whiskey at my friend's wedding, wasn't entirely serious about it." "Oh." The single syllable carried all her disappointment. Garrett winced at her tone. "Not that I wasn't open to the idea," he amended quickly. "Just didn't expect anything to come of it. When no response arrived, I put it out of my mind." "And now you have an uninvited guest," Callie said ruefully. "A guest who cooks like this is welcome anytime," Garrett replied with a small smile, "but I understand your predicament. We'll figure something out tomorrow." After dinner, Callie insisted on washing up while Garrett brought in more firewood. When she finished in the kitchen, she found him building up the fire against the evening chill. "I should turn in," she said, suddenly aware of how improper their situation might appear to others. "It's been a long journey," Garrett nodded. "Of course, your trunk's already upstairs. If you need anything, just call out. I'm a light sleeper." Callie climbed the stairs to the spare bedroom, fighting exhaustion and disappointment in equal measure. The room was simple but comfortable, a sturdy bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a pitcher and bowl, a small chest of drawers, and a rocking chair by the window. She changed into her nightgown, washed her face, and brushed out her long chestnut hair. As she climbed into bed, the reality of her situation hit her fully. She had no job to return to, barely enough money for a ticket back east, and nowhere to go if she did return. What had seemed like a brave new beginning now felt like foolish impetuosity. Downstairs, Garrett sat before the fire, turning the day's events over in his mind. The woman sleeping in his spare room was nothing like he'd imagined when he'd penned that advertisement in a moment of loneliness. He'd expected someone practical to the point of plainness, not the composed beauty with intelligent eyes who now slept under his roof. The next morning, Callie woke to sunshine streaming through the curtains and the smell of coffee brewing. She dressed quickly in a simple blue dress, pinned up her hair, and descended the stairs to find Garrett already at the stove, frying bacon. "Good morning," he said, glancing up. "Coffee's ready if you want some. Figured you might appreciate not having to cook after your journey." "Thank you." Callie poured herself a cup, surprised by this thoughtful gesture. "I didn't expect you to make breakfast." "I'm not completely helpless in the kitchen," Garrett replied with a hint of a smile. "Just not as skilled as you." They ate breakfast together, the atmosphere less tense than the night before. When they finished, Garrett leaned back in his chair, regarding her thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about your situation," he began. "Wallace Creek has no school, but they need one. The town's growing. Several families have mentioned wanting to hire a teacher." Callie's heart quickened. "Are you suggesting I stay in Wallace Creek?" "It's an option," Garrett said carefully. "You'd need somewhere to stay, of course. Mrs. Peterson at the boarding house takes in respectable women." "That's very kind of you to suggest," Callie said, trying to hide her disappointment. She traveled all this way to be a wife, not to continue as a schoolteacher in a different location. "Yet what choice did she have? I'll take you into town today," Garrett continued. "You can meet with Mayor Thompson about the teaching position, and I'll introduce you to Mrs. Peterson." Callie nodded, resigned. "That sounds sensible." They set out for town an hour later, Callie's trunk loaded in Garrett's wagon. The ride was less uncomfortable than the day before, with Garrett pointing out landmarks and telling her about the area. "Those mountains to the west mark the edge of my property," he explained. "Got about 5,000 acres all told. Most of it's grazing land for the cattle, but there's good water and timber too." "It's beautiful country," Callie admitted, taking in the vast Montana landscape, "different from Missouri." "Harder in some ways, but there's a freedom to it," Garrett said, "space to breathe." In town, Garrett first took her to meet Mayor Thompson, a portly man with an impressive mustache who was immediately taken with the idea of a qualified teacher coming to Wallace Creek. "The children have been learning in the back room of the church with whoever can spare the time," he explained. "Having a proper teacher would be a blessing, Miss Chapman." "I'd be happy to help," Callie said. "When could I start?" "Immediately," the mayor beamed. "We can offer room and board plus a small salary to start. Once we see how many students enroll, we might increase it." The arrangement was quickly settled. Garrett then took her to meet Mrs. Peterson, a kindly widow whose boarding house was clean and well-maintained. "I only take respectable single ladies," Mrs. Peterson explained, showing Callie a small but pleasant room. "No gentlemen callers upstairs, meals included, laundry once a week." By midday, Callie's future was arranged: a teaching position, a place to stay, and the beginning of a new life, just not the one she'd traveled so far to find. As they stood outside the boarding house, Callie's trunk now delivered to her room, an awkward moment stretched between them. "Thank you for your help, Mr. Irwin," Callie said formally. "I apologize again for the confusion of my arrival." "No need to apologize," Garrett replied. "I'm sorry my letter never reached me, but I think this arrangement might work out well for you. Wallace Creek needs a teacher like you." "Yes, it seems providential after all," Callie agreed, trying to sound more enthusiastic than she felt. Garrett shifted uncomfortably. "Well, I should be getting back to the ranch. Got cattle to check on the north pasture, of course." Callie extended her hand. "Goodbye, Mr. Irwin," Garrett took her hand briefly, his much larger one engulfing hers. "Miss Chapman, good luck with your teaching." As his wagon pulled away, Callie felt a strange emptiness. In less than 24 hours, she had arrived with such hope, discovered her future husband didn't know she existed, and now found herself established in a frontier town as its new schoolteacher. Life certainly took unexpected turns. The following weeks passed in a blur of activity. The town enthusiastically embraced their new teacher, converting the back room of the church into a proper classroom with desks donated by families. 27 students enrolled, ranging from 6 to 16 years of age with varying levels of previous education. Callie threw herself into her work, finding purpose in the eager faces of her students. Mrs. Peterson proved a kind landlady, and several of the town's women made efforts to welcome her into the community. But in quiet moments, particularly at night, Callie found her thoughts drifting to the Irwin ranch and its owner. She'd seen Garrett only once since that day, a glimpse across the general store. He'd tipped his hat politely but hadn't approached. A month after her arrival, Callie was startled by a knock on the classroom door after the students had departed. She looked up to find Elijah Wilson, the elderly postmaster, standing in the doorway, clutching his hat nervously. "Miss Chapman," he began, "I've come to apologize. Seems I made a terrible mistake with your correspondence." "Mr. Wilson," the old man stepped forward. "Young Jimmy was cleaning behind the mail counter yesterday and found your letter to Mr. Irwin. It had fallen behind the sorting desk. Never delivered it." He held out a dirt-smudged envelope. "I'm getting too old for this job, miss. My eyes ain't what they used to be." Callie took the letter with trembling hands, her careful acceptance of Garrett Irwin's proposal, with details of her journey and her hopes for their future together. The letter that should have prepared him for her arrival. "Thank you for bringing this, Mr. Wilson," she said quietly. "Figured you should have it even now. Again, I'm mighty sorry for the trouble it caused." After Wilson left, Callie sat staring at the letter. Should she destroy it? What purpose would it serve now? She carefully tucked it into her desk drawer, unable to discard it but uncertain what to do with it. The answer came 2 days later, when Garrett Irwin himself appeared at her classroom door after school. He stood awkwardly, hat in hand, looking somehow larger and more imposing in the small schoolroom. "Mr. Irwin," Callie said, surprised. "Can I help you with something, Miss Chapman?" He cleared his throat. "I was wondering if you might allow me to escort you to the Harvest Festival this Saturday." "As friends," he added quickly. Callie blinked in surprise. "The Harvest Festival? Town holds it every year. Dancing, food, games for the children. Thought you might enjoy it, being new to Wallace Creek." "That's very kind of you," Callie said carefully. "But may I ask what prompted this invitation?" Garrett's cheeks colored slightly. "Truth is, Miss Chapman, I've been thinking about our unusual introduction. Seems unfair that a mix-up with the mail changed both our paths. Thought maybe we could start over. As friends," he repeated. Callie studied him, noting the sincerity in his expression. "I'd be honored to attend the festival with you, Mr. Irwin." Relief visibly passed over his features. "I'll call for you at Mrs. Peterson's at 5 on Saturday, then." After he left, Callie sat at her desk, heart pounding inexplicably. It was just a friendly gesture, she told herself. Nothing more. Saturday arrived with perfect autumn weather, crisp air, golden sunshine, and leaves beginning to turn. Callie chose her best dress, a forest green that complemented her eyes, and Mrs. Peterson helped style her hair. "Mr. Irwin is quite a catch," the older woman commented as she pinned a last curl. "Owns the largest ranch in the county, been turning down eligible ladies for years." "We're attending as friends," Callie clarified. "He felt bad about the misunderstanding when I arrived." Mrs. Peterson's knowing smile suggested she didn't quite believe this explanation. Garrett arrived precisely at 5, looking transformed in clean black trousers, a white shirt, and a bolo tie. He'd clearly visited the barber, his dark hair neatly trimmed, his jaw clean-shaven. "Miss Chapman," he said, eyes widening appreciatively at the sight of her. "You look lovely." "Thank you," Callie replied, suddenly shy. "You look quite handsome yourself." The town square had been transformed for the festival. Lanterns hung from ropes strung between buildings, trestle tables groaned with food, and a band of local musicians played on a makeshift stage. Children ran about playing games, while adults gathered in groups, talking and laughing. "Quite a turnout," Garrett observed as they walked through the crowd. He nodded to several people who called greetings. "It seems the whole town is here," Callie agreed, waving to some of her students. They sampled the food, Garrett introducing her to people she hadn't yet met. To her surprise, he was more social than she'd expected. Though she noticed, he maintained a certain reserve even among those he clearly considered friends. As darkness fell, the band struck up a waltz. Couples moved to the cleared area serving as a dance floor. "Would you care to dance, Miss Chapman?" Garrett asked, extending his hand. Callie hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in his. "I'd be delighted, Mr. Irwin." His hand at her waist was warm and steady as he guided her through the steps. He moved with unexpected grace for such a large man, leading confidently. "You dance very well," Callie commented, surprised. A smile tugged at his lips. "My mother insisted her sons learn, said no woman wants a man who can't lead her around a dance floor properly." "Your mother was wise," Callie laughed. They danced 3 consecutive dances before taking a break for punch. The evening air had grown cooler, and Garrett draped his coat over Callie's shoulders when he noticed her shiver. "Thank you," she said, touched by the gesture. "Miss Chapman," Garrett began, then stopped. "Callie," he corrected himself, "I have a confession to make." Her heart quickened. "Yes, Wilson brought me your letter last week, the one you sent accepting my proposal." Callie's cheeks burned with mortification. "Oh, He found it behind the counter. He mentioned that." "I read it," Garrett continued. "Several times, actually." Unable to meet his eyes, Callie stared at the ground. "It doesn't matter now, we've both moved forward." Garrett's finger gently tilted her chin up, forcing her to look at him. "What if I don't want to move forward? What if I want to go back?" "Back," Callie whispered. "Back to where we should have been if that letter had reached me when it was supposed to," Garrett clarified. "Back to me welcoming a mail-order bride instead of sending her to the boarding house." Callie's pulse raced. "Mr. Irwin, Garrett, what exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying that letter finally reached the right hands, maybe later than intended, but it got there." His green eyes were intense in the lantern light. "You wrote that you were looking for a partner, not just a provider. That you wanted someone to build a life with, someone who valued education and hard work equally." "I remember what I wrote," Callie said softly. "Those were exactly the qualities I was hoping for when I placed that advertisement," Garrett continued. "Then you arrived, and even though it was unexpected, you handled it with grace and dignity. You've shown your character in how you've built something here, how you teach those children." "Are you courting me, Garrett Irwin?" Callie asked directly, her heart in her throat. A slow smile spread across his face. "I believe I am, Callie Chapman, if you'll allow it." Joy bubbled up inside her. "I think I might be amenable to that arrangement." His smile widened. "Good, because I was hoping you might come out to the ranch tomorrow for dinner. As my guest, not someone I'm obligated to shelter for the night. I'd like that very much." The following week saw a proper courtship unfold. Garrett called for Callie every Sunday after church, taking her for drives in his wagon, bringing her wildflowers, and occasionally joining her for dinner at Mrs. Peterson's boarding house. Strictly in the downstairs parlor, under Mrs. Peterson's watchful eye. The town watched their courtship with interest and approval. The respected rancher and the schoolteacher made a handsome couple, and their obvious growing affection for one another was the subject of much pleased gossip. In October, Garrett began construction on an addition to the schoolhouse, a proper teacher's residence attached to the back. "The town can't expect you to live at the boarding house forever," he explained when Callie questioned him about it. "A schoolteacher should have her own home." What went unsaid was that the addition might serve another purpose entirely if their courtship continued its current trajectory. By November, Callie had become a regular Sunday dinner guest at the Irwin Ranch. She would often arrive early to help prepare the meal, and they would spend the afternoon talking or reading together by the fire. On one such Sunday, as they walked back from checking on a new calf in the barn, snowflakes began to fall, the first of the season. "Winter comes early up here," Garrett commented, watching Callie's delighted expression as she tilted her face up to catch the flakes. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "I've never seen snow in such an open landscape before. In the city, it turned to slush almost immediately." Garrett watched her, snowflakes catching in her lashes and on her upturned face. "Callie," he said softly. She turned to him, cheeks flushed from the cold. "Yes, I love you." The simple declaration hung in the crisp air between them. Callie's eyes widened, then softened. "I love you too, Garrett." He closed the distance between them in 2 strides, gathering her in his arms and kissing her with a passion that had been building for months. Callie responded eagerly, her arms sliding around his neck. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Garrett pressed his forehead against hers. "Marry me, Callie, be my wife like you were supposed to be when you arrived." "Yes," she whispered without hesitation. "Yes." They were married 2 weeks later in the Wallace Creek Church, with the entire town in attendance. Callie wore a cream-colored dress ordered specially from Helena, and Garrett looked uncommonly handsome in a new suit. Thomas Crawford stood as Garrett's best man while Mrs. Peterson, who had become something of a surrogate mother to Callie, gave the bride away. After the ceremony, the celebration moved to the town hall, where the community had prepared a feast and decorated the space with winter greenery. The newlyweds danced their first dance as husband and wife to applause and cheers from their friends and neighbors. Late that evening, Garrett drove his bride home to the ranch, their home now. He carried her across the threshold as tradition dictated, setting her down gently in the main room where a fire blazed welcomingly in the hearth. "Welcome home, Mrs. Irwin," he said softly. Callie's heart swelled with joy. "Home," she repeated, savoring the word. "Our home." As winter settled over Wallace Creek, the Irwins settled into married life. Callie continued teaching, riding to town with Garrett when weather permitted, staying with Mrs. Peterson on the occasional day when snow made the return journey impossible. In the evenings, they would sit before the fire, Callie grading papers or reading while Garrett reviewed his ranch accounts, or worked on small woodcarving projects, a hobby Callie had been surprised to discover he enjoyed. Their physical relationship blossomed as well, each discovering in the other a passionate and tender lover. Nights that had once been lonely for both became a cherished time of intimacy and connection. By spring, as the snow melted and the first green appeared on the Montana landscape, Callie had news to share. "Garrett," she said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, "I believe we'll need to prepare the spare room." He looked at her questioningly, then understanding dawned in his eyes. "Are you saying—" "Yes," she nodded, smiling through happy tears. "By late autumn, we'll be 3 instead of 2. Garrett whooped with joy, lifting her from her chair and spinning her around before setting her down gently, suddenly concerned. "Should I not have done that? Will it harm the baby?" Callie laughed. "The baby is fine, Garrett. I'm not made of china." "Still," he said, his hand moving to rest protectively over her still flat stomach, "I aim to take good care of you both." The pregnancy progressed well through the summer months. Callie continued teaching until the end of the school term in June, then focused on preparing for the baby's arrival. Garrett insisted on making the baby's cradle himself, working on it in the evenings while Callie sewed tiny garments. In late October, after a relatively easy labor with the town's midwife in attendance, Callie gave birth to a healthy baby boy whom they named James Thomas Irwin, James after Garrett's late brother, and Thomas after their good friend Crawford, who had inadvertently brought them together. Garrett held his son with wonder, the tiny bundle dwarfed in his large hands. "He's perfect," he whispered, awestruck. "You're both perfect." Life settled into a new rhythm with the baby's arrival. Callie took a break from teaching, focusing on motherhood while gradually taking over more of the ranch's bookkeeping. She discovered she had a talent for the business side of ranching, freeing Garrett to concentrate on the physical aspects. The following spring, Mayor Thompson approached the couple after church. "Mrs. Irwin," he began, "the school board was wondering if you might consider returning to teaching next term. The replacement we hired isn't nearly as effective as you were." Callie glanced at Garrett, who nodded supportively. "Perhaps part-time," she suggested. 3 days a week, I could bring James with me." The arrangement proved successful. On teaching days, Callie would drive herself into town with baby James, teaching the morning sessions while Mrs. Peterson watched the baby, then conducting afternoon lessons with James napping in a makeshift crib in the corner of the classroom. The older girls doted on him when he was awake, and the arrangement gave many of the students their first exposure to an infant. On her days at the ranch, Callie managed the household, kept the books, and increasingly provided input on ranch decisions. Garrett valued her perspective, and together they began expanding the operation, purchasing adjacent land when it became available and increasing their herd. 2 years after James's birth, the Irwins welcomed a daughter, Catherine Sarah, named for Callie's mother and Garrett's late sister-in-law. Their family felt complete, and the ranch thrived under their joint management. As the years passed, Wallace Creek grew from a small frontier settlement into a proper town. The railroad finally reached them in 1885, bringing increased commerce and new settlers. The Irwin Ranch expanded to become one of the most successful operations in the territory, and Callie's part-time teaching evolved into serving on the school board and eventually helping to establish the town's first proper library. James and Catherine grew into healthy, intelligent children who embodied the best qualities of both parents, James with his father's strength and his mother's intellect, Catherine with her mother's grace and her father's determination. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Garrett surprised Callie with a trip to St. Louis, her first return to her hometown since her journey west. They traveled in comfort on the railroad that now connected Montana to the rest of the country, the children left in the capable care of Mrs. Peterson, now retired but still a dear friend, and Thomas Crawford's wife, Ellen. In St. Louis, they visited the sites of Callie's youth, now transformed by a decade of growth and change. The contrast between her former life and her current one could not have been more stark. "Any regrets?" Garrett asked as they stood on the banks of the Mississippi River on their last evening in the city. Callie looked up at her husband, still handsome at 43, with silver now threading his dark hair at the temples, laugh lines etched around his eyes from years of happiness. "Not one," she answered truthfully. "Everything that happened, even the confusion and the letter that went astray, it all led us exactly where we needed to be." Garrett wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close against the evening chill. "Who would have thought a misplaced letter could lead to so much happiness?" "It found its way to the right hands eventually," Callie reminded him, echoing his words from years ago. "Just as I did. Back in Wallace Creek, their life continued to evolve and flourish." James eventually attended college in Denver, returning with new agricultural techniques that further improved the ranch. Catherine became a teacher like her mother, eventually taking over as the school's headmistress. In their later years, Garrett and Callie watched their grandchildren play in the same fields where their children had once run. The ranch house had been expanded several times over the decades, but remained the heart of their world, a testament to the life they had built together from such unlikely beginnings. On their 40th anniversary, surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and the friends who had become family, Garrett raised a toast to his wife. "To Callie," he said, his voice still strong despite his 73 years, "who traveled 500 miles on the strength of a letter that never reached me. Thank God you were stubborn enough to come anyway." "To Garrett," Callie returned, her eyes twinkling with the same spark that had first captured his heart, "who said you've reached the right hands when that letter finally found him. You were right, my love. They were exactly the right hands. As evening settled over the Montana landscape they both loved, Garrett and Callie sat on the porch of their home, hands clasped as they had been countless times over the decades. From an uncertain beginning, a mail-order bride whose letter went astray and a rancher who didn't know she was coming, they had forged a lifetime of love, family, and partnership. And in the fading light, as they watched their grandchildren chase fireflies across the yard, both silently thanked whatever fate, divine intervention, or simple human error had brought them together on that summer day so many years before.